Before I tell you what happened, I need you to understand something first. We all know to guard ourselves against people who mean us harm from the beginning. The loud ones, the obvious ones, the strangers. Nobody ever tells you how to guard yourself against someone who sat at your Thanksgiving table for 11 years and called you dad. I'm 63 years old. I spent 31 years as a senior electrical inspector for the city of Columbus, Ohio. I know how systems work. I know how things fail quietly, from the inside, long before anyone notices. And I still didn't see it coming. When my wife passed 18 months ago, I thought the hardest thing I would ever face was already behind me. I was wrong. The morning everything finally broke open, I was sitting in a conference room on the 4th floor of a law office downtown. The carpet was that flat, industrial gray that every serious building uses. The table was long and cold and smelled faintly of furniture polish. My daughter sat across from me for the first time in months, with her hands folded in her lap, not looking at me. And between us, placed there like a piece of evidence in a case nobody had filed yet, sat a small black smart home speaker. Compact, cylindrical, quiet, the same one her husband had given me 8 months earlier, smiling, telling me it would make the house feel less empty. He wasn't wrong about that. He was wrong about everything else. To understand how I ended up in that room, you have to go back to late February of last year, about 6 weeks after I finally got settled into the house on Elmsford Drive. After my wife died, I couldn't stay in the old place. 34 years of a life lived together will fill a house in ways you don't realize until you're alone in it. Every corner reminded me of her. The garden she kept, the teacup she left on the windowsill, the sound of her slippers on the kitchen floor that I kept expecting to hear every single morning. My daughter said it made sense to downsize. She and her husband helped me find a smaller ranch-style house about 12 minutes from theirs. 2 bedrooms, 1 story, the kind of place where you can hear the furnace from anywhere. I told myself it was practical. The truth is, I just needed to stop waiting to hear those slippers. Her husband helped me move in. He carried boxes, assembled shelves, hooked up my television. He was efficient about it, the way he was efficient about most things. I had always respected that about him, even when I didn't particularly warm to him. He had a way of managing situations before they needed managing, always a step ahead of the next inconvenience. I thought that was a good quality in a son-in-law. I was still learning what it looked like in a man who wanted something from you. The speaker was his idea. He brought it over on a Saturday, pulled it out of a box with the kind of casual generosity that's hard to question without feeling ungrateful. "You'll love it," he said, already crouching down to plug it in. "Just talk to it. Ask it anything. You can use it to set reminders, check the weather, call us if you need to." He spent 20 minutes setting it up, walking me through the features, showing me how to ask it to play the jazz station I liked. When he left that afternoon, he clapped me on the shoulder and said, "You're all set." I used it every morning after that. Asked it about the weather before I got dressed. Had it play music while I made coffee. Reminded myself about doctor's appointments, about calling my old colleague Frank about our fishing trip in April, about the property tax payment coming due. It made the silence feel less total. I had been retired for 2 years but stayed in close touch with a few people from the office. One of them, a woman who had worked in the city's IT infrastructure division for over 20 years before she retired, came by for coffee on a Tuesday in March. She was sharp, the kind of person who still reads technical manuals for pleasure and keeps up with every security bulletin that crosses her email. She set her mug down and looked at the speaker on my kitchen counter the way a doctor looks at something they recognize but weren't expecting to find. "Who set that up for you?" she asked. I told her my son-in-law had taken care of it. She was quiet for a moment. "Do you know what account it's registered to?" I didn't. I had never thought to ask. She walked over and went through the device settings with the practiced ease of someone who has spent decades thinking about what systems do when nobody's paying attention. Her face didn't change much, but I saw something shift behind her eyes. The same shift I had learned to recognize in 30 years of inspections when a professional notices something that doesn't belong. She put the mug down and said carefully, "This is linked to an account that isn't yours." I said I didn't understand. She explained it to me at the counter, slow and clear. The speaker had been configured to a second account. Everything it heard in range, every conversation, every word spoken in my kitchen had been accessible remotely to whoever held that account. 8 months of my mornings, 8 months of my phone calls, 8 months of me sitting alone in my house saying things out loud that I never thought anyone was recording. She asked me to write down exactly what I remembered saying near it, and she drove me to the police station herself. The detective who took the report was thorough and quiet. He asked technical questions I mostly couldn't answer, then had a technician examine the device while I sat in the waiting area and stared at the floor tiles and tried to remember everything I had ever said in that kitchen. What I had said about the investment account I had not yet transferred since my wife's estate was settled. What I had said about the health issues my doctor wanted to monitor. What I had said to Frank on the phone about being tired, about days when the house felt too large, about sometimes wondering whether I was managing as well as I told people I was. When the detective came back, he said it plainly. The device had been configured with an account that could stream audio and access location data. Whoever held that account could activate the speaker's ambient listening remotely. He told me not to confront anyone. He said to act as if everything was normal. I drove home with both hands tight on the wheel, the way I used to grip it in the first few months after my wife died, when grief would hit me suddenly at intersections, and I would have to focus on something ordinary just to keep moving forward. I sat in the driveway for a long time before I went inside. That night, I set the speaker on the counter and looked at it for a while. Then I walked to the window and watched the street, the quiet dark of a neighborhood where everyone had already gone to bed, and I tried to think clearly instead of angrily. Anger was something I could not afford right now. I had spent 31 years walking into buildings where the electrical work was wrong, where shortcuts had been taken, where someone had assumed no one would check. The job had taught me one thing more than any other. You don't fix a broken system by pulling everything out at once. You trace the fault carefully. You find exactly where it started. Then you correct it cleanly. I decided to do the same here. I started slowly. The speaker stayed on the counter, still plugged in, still linked to that account. I started talking near it the way I always had, casually, naturally, except now I thought about every word I said. I mentioned to no one in particular that I had been thinking about revising my power of attorney, that I wanted everything reviewed by a new attorney before I signed anything, that I had moved my primary accounts to a different bank. None of it was true. The responses came within 48 hours. My son-in-law called to check in, something he did once a week at most. He asked how I was feeling, whether I was keeping up with things, whether I had thought about getting some help with the financial paperwork from the estate. He mentioned, almost in passing, that it might make sense to get all that organized before it became overwhelming. I said I was fine and that I had it handled. He said great. He sounded slightly tighter than usual. Not enough for most people to notice. I noticed. I called my daughter the next day, a conversation I had been rehearsing in my head for 2 days. I asked her how things were going, and at the end I said casually that I had been looking into possibly changing banks. She paused, then she said, "Oh, Marcus mentioned something about that. He thought maybe you needed help navigating all that paperwork." I asked her who Marcus had heard it from. She didn't have a clear answer. She said he must have mentioned it in conversation. I got off the phone and went to sit in the armchair by the window, the one my wife had picked out at an estate sale, and reupholstered herself in the autumn before she got sick. I sat there for a long time. I thought about my daughter's voice, the way she sounded not suspicious but confused, like she was relaying something she had heard and hadn't quite thought to question. She didn't know. I believed that then, and I still believe it now. But not knowing is its own kind of participation. The next thing I found was not in my own house. My daughter had come over on a Sunday to bring groceries and help me sort through some of her mother's remaining boxes. She left her bag on the kitchen chair when she went to use the bathroom, and a folder slid out onto the seat. I would not have looked, except that I recognized my own name on the tab. I picked it up. Inside were printed documents. Clean, recent, the kind printed from a template. Power of attorney forms, blank but annotated in handwriting I recognized as my son-in-law's. Notes beside certain sections. A checklist with items circled. One page was a printout of an article about cognitive decline assessments in adults over 60 and the legal thresholds for establishing incapacity. My name was at the top of a handwritten note. Under it, in neat block letters, struggles with routine tasks. Difficulty managing finances alone. Wife recently deceased. Lives alone. No close family nearby, except daughter. I put the folder back exactly as I had found it and went to pour water at the sink, keeping my back to the room until I could be certain my face was neutral. My daughter came back and we spent the afternoon going through boxes. I listened to her talk about her garden, about a trip they were planning, about her daughter's upcoming recital. I answered normally. I handed her a photo of her mother from 1987 and watched her eyes go soft. I kept my voice steady all afternoon. After she left, I drove to a parking lot near the library and called my old colleague. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she said, "He's building a case that you can't manage your own affairs. The audio is the evidence. The paperwork is the argument." I already knew that. What I needed was to understand how far along it was. She helped me think through what to do next. She reminded me of something she had always said at work. Document everything in writing, because memory is fallible and paper is not. She helped me put together a written log. Dates, times, conversations, the exact wording of everything my son-in-law had said to me in the past 8 months that now looked different in hindsight. The questions about my health, the gentle suggestions about financial planning, the time he had asked, almost sympathetically, whether I had ever thought about a situation where I couldn't make decisions for myself and whether I had made arrangements for that. I had taken that as thoughtfulness. The detective confirmed that the account linked to the speaker had been active throughout the period since the device was installed. He told me the case was building, but that it required more before they could move. So I gave them more. For the next 2 weeks, I let the speaker hear exactly what I wanted it to hear. I spoke in my kitchen about an appointment I had invented with an estate attorney, about papers I was in the process of signing. I said, clearly and plainly, that I had decided to name my son-in-law as secondary agent on a financial document I was drawing up. I said I trusted him. The next morning he texted me. He had heard about the appointment somehow, he said. He wanted to offer to come with me to the attorney's office for support. Said these things could be confusing, that it always helped to have a second set of ears. He was available any day that week. He used that phrase, a second set of ears. I read it twice. Then I forwarded the text to the detective. The meeting that followed was not at the attorney's office my son-in-law expected. It was at the office of the attorney I had actually retained, a woman with 30 years of elder law experience whose assistant had been coordinating with the detective for 4 days. My daughter was there because I had asked her to be. I had not told her everything, but I had told her enough that she had agreed to come without her husband. That had been harder than I expected to arrange. She had asked me twice if I was sure about all of this. I had told her that I was, and that I needed her to trust me the way I had always trusted her. My son-in-law arrived in a good-known jacket, carrying a legal pad, looking organized and prepared. He shook the attorney's hand warmly. He nodded at me across the table the way he always did, the nod that said he was managing things, that everything was under control, that I could relax because he was here. I had my hands folded on the table. I was very calm. The attorney opened with what she described as a review of my estate documents. She slid a copy of his text message across the table first. My son-in-law glanced at it and said he was just trying to be helpful, that I had been struggling since the loss of my wife, that the family was concerned. The attorney asked whether he had been granted any legal authority to act on my behalf. He said not yet, but that they had discussed it. She asked when. He paused. He looked at me. I looked back at him and did not say anything. She placed the folder on the table. The printout from my daughter's bag, the annotated power of attorney forms, the page with my name, and the notes about cognitive decline. My daughter made a sound I won't forget. Something quiet that she pulled back almost immediately, like a door closing. He said those were just notes, just contingency planning, just him being responsible. The attorney said, responsible for whom? He shifted. He said I had been forgetting things, that I had mentioned it myself, that my daughter was worried. My daughter said, very quietly, I never told you that. He turned to her. He started to explain. His voice was still controlled, but the pace had changed. Faster, more syllables jammed into each sentence, the way a structure sounds when the load-bearing part gives way. The attorney pressed a button on a small recorder. My voice filled the room. Me at my kitchen counter, early on a Thursday morning, talking about being tired, about how much I missed my wife, about worrying whether I was keeping up with everything as well as I should. Private things. The kind of things a man says when he believes he's alone. My son-in-law's face changed. The detective, who had been sitting off to the side without a word, placed the speaker on the table. My son-in-law said he could explain that. He said the account setup had been a mistake, a default setting, that he hadn't realized it was configured that way. The detective asked how long the account had been actively accessed. He stopped talking. My daughter was looking at him the way you look at a wall when you realize what you thought was solid isn't. Not angry yet. Somewhere before anger, in the part that comes first, the part that doesn't have a name, but that anyone who's ever been badly wrong about someone will recognize. The attorney laid out what came next. The recordings, the documents, the contact made with my financial institutions by a party without authorization. My son-in-law said one more time that his only concern had been my well-being. I spoke then, for the first time in the meeting. I said, I know, and I meant it. I think some part of him had actually started there, with something that looked like concern. I think the concern had been real once, in the way that a fire starts with something small before it becomes something that consumes things. I didn't say that part out loud. I just let it settle. The detective asked him to come with him. He stood. He looked at my daughter. She did not look back at him. He looked at me. I held his gaze until he turned away. At the door, he paused. I said, "You could have just asked." He left without answering. The room was very quiet after that. The attorney gave my daughter a moment and did not rush anything. I refilled my water from the pitcher on the table and drank it slowly. Outside the window, Columbus was doing what it does in late October. Gray and steady, the kind of day that doesn't ask anything of you. My daughter cried in the parking lot. Not dramatically, not the way you see in movies. The way adults cry when something true and terrible has been confirmed. A tight, contained kind of grief that she held close to herself while I stood next to her and said nothing. Because there are moments when the only honest thing is to let someone feel what they feel without trying to fix it. We drove separately back to her house. We sat at her kitchen table for 2 hours with decaf and the lights on low and talked, or didn't talk, in turns. She asked me things, I answered honestly. She told me things I listened to carefully. There were parts of it she had known, small pieces that had seemed like nothing on their own, that she kept picking up and turning over in her hands, now that she could see the shape of the whole. At one point she said, "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I told her the truth. Because I wasn't sure what she knew. Because I needed to be certain before I asked her to choose. Because I had not wanted to be wrong about my own daughter. She put her hand over mine on the table and kept it there for a while. The weeks that followed were the kind that move slowly but leave a mark. I met with my attorney several times. I updated every document, every account, every password. I learned things about my own financial situation that I should have reviewed years earlier. Gaps and oversights that had nothing to do with my son-in-law and everything to do with the comfortable assumption that tomorrow is always available for the things you keep meaning to do. I closed accounts and opened new ones. I read the documents I signed before I signed them. The detective checked in once. He told me the investigation was ongoing and that I should expect it to take time. He was careful not to promise outcomes, but his tone carried something solid in it that I appreciated. At work, I had retired, but I still met Frank for coffee every few weeks, and I told him some of it over a corner table at the diner we had been going to since the mid-90s. He listened the way old friends do, without rushing to conclusions or filling silences with advice. When I finished, he said, "You handled it right." I told him I wasn't sure about that. He said, "You handled it right again," and picked up his coffee, and we talked about the fishing trip for a while, which helped more than I expected. My daughter and I talked more in those 2 months than we had in the previous 2 years. Not always about what had happened. Sometimes about her mother, sometimes about nothing important. The conversations were careful at first, the way conversations are when something has broken and the pieces are still too sharp to touch without thinking. But they got easier, not back to what they were, exactly, because you cannot always return to what something was. Sometimes things change shape and become something different, and if you're fortunate, what they become is sturdier than what they were before. I went back to the small house on Elmsford Drive most nights. I made dinner, listened to the jazz station, watched the news. The speaker was gone from the kitchen counter. I had given it to the detective when this started, as part of the documentation. The counter looked bare without it for a while, and then it just looked like a counter. I bought a small radio to replace it, the kind with a dial and an antenna that you have to adjust depending on the weather. It gets static sometimes. You have to reach over and turn the tuner by hand to find the signal again. It is inconvenient in the specific, honest way that things are when they belong entirely to you. One evening, about 6 weeks after the meeting at the law office, I was sitting in my wife's armchair, the reupholstered one by the window, with a cup of tea and the radio playing low. The street outside was quiet. The furnace came on with its familiar click and settled into its low hum, a sound I had stopped noticing and then started noticing again, the way you notice things when the louder sounds have cleared away. I thought about how long the speaker had been on my counter, how many mornings it had heard, how many times I had spoken openly in my own kitchen without thinking twice because I was alone, and being alone had felt safe, and I had trusted the silence. I thought about what it means to protect yourself without becoming someone who can no longer trust anything. That is the balance I am still working out. I do not think the answer is to stop trusting people. I think the answer is to pay closer attention to the difference between someone who wants to be near you and someone who wants to be inside your decisions. At 63, I know some things that I did not know at 40. I know that vulnerability is not a personality flaw. I know that grief opens doors in us that we don't always notice have been left open. I know that people who want to exploit those openings are not always strangers. Sometimes they are people who have been at your table for years, who know exactly which door is unlocked, who have been watching for long enough to know when you are most likely to leave it unguarded. I also know this. The most dangerous thing I did in all of this was nothing I did in a conference room or a law office or a police station. The most dangerous thing I did was spend 8 months talking to a device in my kitchen that I had never verified was mine. I am an electrical inspector. I know how systems work. I know you always verify the power source before you trust the line. I just forgot to apply that to my own house. So if you are listening to this and you have a device in your home that someone else set up for you, check the account it is registered to. Tonight, before you go to sleep. Not because everyone who sets up a device for you has bad intentions. Most people who do it are being kind, and that kindness is real, and you should not let one story turn you against every gesture of care. But check anyway. Because protecting yourself is not an insult to the people who love you. It is simply being as careful with your own life as you would be with anything else that matters. Write things down. Keep copies somewhere only you can reach. Talk to an attorney about your documents before someone else brings it up as a suggestion. These are not signs of fear or decline or distrust. They are the ordinary maintenance that a life requires. The same way a house requires maintenance. The same way any system left unexamined will eventually develop faults in places you didn't think to look. I still live on Elmsford Drive. The garden is not what my wife would have made of it, but it is tended. The furnace still clicks on at the same time every morning. I still drink my coffee standing at the kitchen counter, looking out at whatever the sky is doing. The counter is quieter now. I don't mind. Thank you for watching this video. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Every voice matters here. Don't forget to subscribe to Voices of Uncle Arthur and share this with someone who needs to hear it today.